Sometimes loneliness weighs heavier than any burden a man can carry on his back. For Elias Boone, a mountain man living high in the Colorado Rockies, the silence of his cabin had become unbearable. He sent for a mail-order bride, hoping for companionship in his later years. When the day finally came, he stood at the edge of his land waiting. But the woman who arrived wasn't standing at all. Clara sat in a wooden wheelchair on a neighbor's porch, her legs lost to a childhood accident. The matchmaker had hidden the truth, fearing Elias would turn her away. He walked toward her slowly, his hands trembling as he held her unopened letter. What he saw in her eyes would change everything he thought he knew about strength. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like every other morning in Elias Boone's life for the past 22 years. He woke before dawn, the cold mountain air biting at his face as he stirred from beneath the heavy bearskin blanket. His hand reached instinctively for the hand-carved walking stick propped against the wall, a companion that had seen him through 2 decades of solitary living in these unforgiving peaks. The wood was smooth now, worn by his calloused palm, and he gripped it as he rose from his bed with the careful movements of a man whose body remembered every hard winter, every misstep on rocky trails, every night spent in the bitter cold. The cabin was small but sturdy, built with his own hands when he was younger and stronger. Thick logs chinked with mud and moss kept out the worst of the wind. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney rising straight and true through the roof. The furniture was spare and practical, a table, 2 chairs he'd made years ago when he still hoped someone might join him, a cupboard for provisions, and the bed in the corner. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. There was no room for sentiment in a life like his, or so he'd told himself for years. He kindled the fire back to life, coaxing flames from the embers he'd banked the night before. The ritual was soothing in its familiarity. Water from the bucket, coffee grounds measured carefully, the pot set to boil. While he waited, Elias stepped outside into the crystalline morning, his breath forming clouds in the thin air. The sun hadn't yet crested the eastern peaks, but the sky was brightening, turning from deep purple to soft rose. From his porch, the view stretched for miles. The valley below was a patchwork of meadows and pine forests, cut through by a silver ribbon of creek that eventually joined the larger river to the south. Beyond that, more mountains rose in successive waves of blue and gray, fading into the distance until earth and sky became indistinguishable. It was beautiful in a way that could break your heart if you let it. Elias had learned long ago not to let it. He was 53 years old, though the mountains had a way of making a man look older. His face was weathered, lined deep around the eyes and mouth. His beard was more gray than brown now, and his hair had receded at the temples. But his body was still strong, his shoulders broad, his hands capable. He could still split wood for hours, still track game through difficult terrain, still survive conditions that would kill softer men. The mountain had tested him countless times, and he had never failed it. But lately, something had changed. The winters felt longer. The silence felt heavier. He'd wake in the night and listen to the wind howling around the cabin, and instead of the fierce satisfaction he'd always felt at his own survival, he felt something else. Something that gnawed at him in the dark hours. Loneliness. Elias Boone had come to these mountains as a young man, running from grief he couldn't name and didn't want to face. There had been a woman once, back in Missouri. Margaret. They'd been engaged to marry. But childbirth had taken her and the baby both, and Elias had found he couldn't stay in a place where every street corner reminded him of what he'd lost. So he'd gone west, kept going until there was nowhere left to go but up. The mountains had offered him solitude, and for years that had been enough. He'd built this cabin, learned to trap and hunt, traded furs in the settlement below for supplies, made a life that required no one and depended on nothing but his own 2 hands and his knowledge of the wild. The few neighbors scattered throughout the valley respected him. They knew he was fair in his dealings, reliable if you needed help with a difficult task, but not a man who sought out company. He attended no church socials, no barn raisings, unless his help was specifically requested. He was the mountain man, and that suited everyone just fine. But now, as he stood on his porch watching the sun finally break over, the peaks flooding the valley with golden light, Elias had to admit the truth to himself. He was tired of being alone. The decision to send for a bride had not come easily. It felt like an admission of weakness, a betrayal of the self-sufficient life he'd built. For months he'd wrestled with the idea, pushing it away, then finding it creeping back into his thoughts as he ate solitary meals or lay awake listening to the empty cabins settle around him. Finally, on a supply run to town last spring, he'd seen the advertisement in the newspaper, a matchmaking service. Women seeking husbands in the Western Territories, men seeking wives. He'd torn the page from the paper and carried it folded in his pocket for 2 weeks before he finally sat down to write the letter. It had taken him most of an evening to compose something that felt honest without being desperate. He'd been plain about his circumstances. He lived in the mountains. The life was hard. He had enough to provide for a family. But there would be no luxuries. He was not young. He was not educated. But he was steady. And he would treat a wife with respect and care for her to the best of his ability. He asked only that she be willing to work, unafraid of solitude and strong enough for the frontier. He'd sent the letter and tried not to think about it. Weeks passed. Then a month. He told himself it had been foolish, that no woman in her right mind would choose such a life. But then the reply came. The matchmaker had found someone. Her name was Clara. She was 28 years old. She could read and write. She was skilled with a needle and knew her way around a kitchen. She understood the realities of frontier life and was prepared for them. She would arrive in late summer, once the mountain passes were fully clear. The matchmaker's letter included no photograph, which didn't surprise Elias. Such things were expensive and rare. There was only a brief note from Clara herself, her handwriting neat and measured. Mr. Boone, it read, I accept your proposal with gratitude and hope. I promise to be a true partner to you in all things. I ask only that you give me time to prove my worth. Respectfully, Clara Hartwell. Something about those words had moved him. The dignity in them, the quiet strength. He'd read the letter a dozen times, trying to imagine the woman who'd written it. In his mind, she became a figure both substantial and elusive, someone real enough to pin his hopes on, but undefined enough that he wouldn't be disappointed. He'd spent the following weeks preparing the cabin with a care he hadn't exercised in years. He'd repaired the chinking in the walls, replaced worn floorboards, made sure the roof was sound. He'd built a second chair for the table and brought up extra provisions from town. He'd even attempted to make the place look less stark, though he wasn't sure what that meant. Flowers seemed impractical. He settled for making sure everything was clean and in good repair. And now the day had come. Clara was due to arrive on the afternoon stagecoach. Elias had planned to ride down to meet her at the settlement, help her with whatever belongings she'd brought, and bring her up to the cabin before dark. He was nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a young man courting Margaret. His hands had trembled as he'd shaved that morning, careful not to nick himself. He'd put on his best shirt, the one he saved for rare trips to town. He'd even tried to do something with his hair, though it was too wild and too grey to cooperate much. As he drank his coffee and watched the sun climb higher, Elias allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe this would work. Maybe Clara would be everything he needed, and maybe, just maybe, he could be what she needed too. Maybe the cabin wouldn't feel so empty anymore. Maybe the winters wouldn't feel so long. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, and went inside to gather a few things for the journey down to the settlement. His saddlebags, a canteen, the letter from Clara, which he'd kept folded in his shirt pocket. He checked his appearance one more time in the small mirror above the wash basin, decided he looked as presentable as a mountain man could look, and headed out to saddle his horse. The ride down would take most of the morning. The stagecoach was due around 2 in the afternoon. That would give him time to stable his horse, maybe have a word with Samuel Henderson, whose homestead sat at the edge of the settlement. Samuel and his wife Ruth were good people, and Elias figured he might need some moral support when he finally came face to face with his bride. As he guided his horse down the narrow trail, the walking stick secured to his saddle, Elias tried to imagine how the afternoon would unfold. He'd rehearsed it in his mind 100 times. He would greet Clara politely but warmly. He would help her down from the coach. He would introduce himself properly, tell her he was pleased she'd come, and assure her that he would do everything in his power to make her comfortable and safe. They would gather her belongings, and then they would begin the journey up the mountain to her new home. It all seemed so simple in his mind, so straightforward. He had no idea that by the end of this day, every assumption he'd made would be shattered, and his life would be changed in ways he could never have anticipated. The settlement at the base of the valley was hardly more than a cluster of buildings scattered along both sides of the main road. A general store, a smithy, a small church, and perhaps a dozen homesteads spread out across the flatter land where farming was possible. The stagecoach station was little more than a covered platform attached to the side of the general store, but it served its purpose well enough. Twice a week, the coach came through carrying mail, supplies, and the occasional passenger. Elias arrived with an hour to spare. He tied his horse outside the store and nodded to Ben Carlisle, the proprietor, who was sweeping the porch. "Afternoon, Elias," Ben called. "Heard you got a bride coming in today." Word traveled fast in small settlements. Elias felt heat rise in his face, but kept his expression neutral. "That's right. Well, that's fine news. Real fine. Ruth Henderson's been beside herself with excitement. Says it'll be good to have another woman in the valley." Elias nodded, not trusting himself to say more. He walked over to the Hendersons' place, a neat cabin with a well-tended garden and smoke rising from the chimney. Samuel was mending a fence post when Elias approached. "Elias." Samuel straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was a younger man, maybe 35, with an easy smile and the capable hands of someone who knew how to work the land. "Big day for you." "Seems everyone knows about it," Elias said, trying to keep the irritation from his voice. Samuel grinned. "Small valley, but don't worry. We're all happy for you. Ruth's got some biscuits inside if you want to wait here. The coach should be along shortly." Elias accepted the offer, grateful for something to do with his nervous energy. Inside the cabin, Ruth Henderson greeted him with genuine warmth. She was a sturdy woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron. "Mr. Boone, come in, come in. You must be so excited. What's her name again?" "Clara." "Clara Hartwell," Elias confirmed, accepting the biscuit she pressed into his hand. "I'm sure she's lovely. It takes a brave woman to come all this way to marry a man she's never met." "I admire that." Ruth poured him coffee without asking. "You'll bring her by tomorrow, won't you? Once she's settled? I'd love to meet her." "I expect she'll need some time to adjust," Elias said carefully. "The cabin's pretty remote." Of course. But when she's ready, tell her she's got a friend down here." The words touched something in Elias. He'd been so focused on his own needs, his own loneliness, that he hadn't fully considered what this would mean for Clara. She'd be even more isolated than he was. At least he was used to it. At least he'd chosen it. She'd be trapped on a mountain with a stranger, miles from any other woman, any other soul. The weight of that responsibility settled heavy on his shoulders. The distant sound of horses and wheels interrupted his thoughts. Ruth hurried to the window. "That's the coach." Elias stood, his heart suddenly hammering in his chest. This was it. He set down his coffee cup, straightened his shirt, and walked outside. Samuel was already heading toward the road. Several other neighbors had appeared as well, curious to see the mountain man's bride. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the general store in a cloud of dust. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete, whom Elias had known for years, climbed down from his seat. He caught Elias's eye, and his expression shifted, something Elias couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or pity. "Elias," Pete said, walking over to him while the passengers began to disembark. "I need to talk to you." "Where is she?" Elias looked past him at the coach. An older couple was climbing down, the man helping his wife, a traveling salesman with his cases. "But no young woman, no Clara. She's already here," Pete said quietly. "Got in on the morning run. I took her straight to the Hendersons' place." Elias's confusion must have shown on his face. "What? Why didn't someone tell me?" Pete glanced at Samuel, who looked equally confused. "She asked me to. Said she wanted to freshen up a bit before meeting you. Mrs. Henderson's been looking after her." Something was wrong. Elias could feel it in the way Pete wouldn't quite meet his eyes, in the way the man's voice had gone soft. "Where is she now?" "On the porch," Pete said. "At the Hendersons." "But Elias, there's something you should know." Elias didn't wait to hear the rest. He turned and walked toward the Henderson cabin, his stride long and purposeful. His mind raced through possibilities. Was she ill? Injured on the journey? Why would she arrive early and not send word? Ruth Henderson stood on her porch, wringing her hands in her apron. Her expression was anxious, almost fearful. "Mr. Boone, And then he saw her. Clara sat in a wooden wheelchair at the far end of the porch, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight. She wore a simple grey dress, modest and well-made. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was pale but composed, with delicate features and eyes that were clear and steady as they met his. She was younger than he'd imagined, and prettier, with a quiet dignity that was immediately apparent. But she wasn't standing. She would never stand. The wheelchair was clearly handmade, the work of someone who cared. The wood was worn smooth by use, the wheels sturdy. A blanket lay across her lap, covering where her legs should have been, but weren't, or at least not in any way that would support her. The world seemed to stop. Elias stood frozen at the bottom of the porch steps, unable to move, unable to speak. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing, to reconcile it with every expectation he'd built up over the past months. "Mr. Boone," Clara said. Her voice was soft but clear, with an accent that spoke of education and refinement. "I'm Clara Hartwell." Ruth Henderson stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Boone, I know this must be a shock. Clara arrived this morning, and she asked me to explain that the matchmaker never told you," Clara finished, her gaze never leaving Elias's face. "Mrs. Morrison was afraid that if you knew about my condition, you would refuse me, so she left it out of her letter." Elias felt something crumpling in his chest. Anger, yes, at the deception, at the matchmaker, at the situation, but something else too, a horrible, shameful disappointment that he immediately hated himself for feeling. Clara seemed to read it in his face. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Resignation, perhaps, or the weary acceptance of someone who'd seen this reaction before. "I have a letter," she said, reaching into a pocket of her dress. "I wrote it before I left Philadelphia. It explains everything, the accident when I was 7, how I've lived since, why I answered your advertisement. I was going to give it to you when we met, but perhaps you'd prefer to read it first. Before you decide." She held out the sealed envelope. Her hand was steady, but Elias could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if braced for a blow. Samuel Henderson had followed Elias, and now stood awkwardly nearby. Ruth's face was creased with concern. Pete, the driver, had joined them too, and several neighbors lingered at a respectful distance, trying not to stare but unable to look away. Elias felt all their eyes on him. felt the weight of this moment, the knowledge that what he did next would define him in their eyes and, more importantly, in his own. He climbed the porch steps slowly, his walking stick tapping against the wood. He crossed to where Clara sat and took the letter from her hand. Up close, he could see that she was trembling slightly, though her face remained calm. He could see the intelligence in her eyes, the pride that wouldn't let her beg or apologize for existing. "I need time," he heard himself say. His voice sounded strange, distant. "To think, to read this." Clara nodded once. "Of course, I'm staying here with the Hendersons tonight. Mrs. Henderson has been very kind." "Tomorrow," Elias said. "I'll come back tomorrow." "I understand." Clara's hands tightened on the arms of her wheelchair. "And if you decide that this won't work, I have enough money for passage back east." "You won't be obligated to tomorrow," Elias repeated, cutting her off. He couldn't hear any more. Right now, couldn't think. His mind was a chaos of emotion he didn't know how to process. He turned and walked away, down the steps, past the watching neighbors. He untied his horse with shaking hands, mounted, and rode away from the settlement without looking back. He didn't head up the mountain toward home. Instead, he rode along the creek, following it upstream until the sounds of the settlement faded entirely. When he was alone, truly alone, he dismounted and sat on a fallen log by the water. He pulled Clara's letter from his pocket, stared at it for a long moment, then carefully broke the seal. The letter was written in the same neat hand as the note that had come with the matchmaker's correspondence, but this was longer, more personal. As he read, the afternoon light faded around him. "Dear Mr. Boone," it began, "by the time you read this, you will know the truth that Mrs. Morrison chose to hide from you. I asked her to be honest. She refused, insisting that no man would accept a crippled bride if he knew beforehand, but that if you met me first, you might see past my limitations. I did not agree with her reasoning, but I was desperate enough to let her have her way. For that deception, I apologize, though I cannot undo it now." The letter went on to describe the accident, a fall from a hayloft when she was 7 years old. The break had been catastrophic, infection had set in, and the country doctor had done what he could. She'd survived, but her legs had not. Her father, a carpenter, had built her first wheelchair. Her mother had taught her everything a woman should know: sewing, cooking, reading, managing a household, all from a seated position. She wrote about her life in Philadelphia after her parents died, the boarding house where she'd worked, keeping books and doing mending, the loneliness of being dependent on others' charity, the men who had courted her briefly out of pity, then disappeared when they realized what marriage to her would actually mean. "I answered your advertisement," she wrote, "because I read between the lines. You are a man who understands hardship, who values practical skills over sentimentality, who lives in a place where survival matters more than social graces. I thought perhaps I might be of use to you. I can manage a household. I can work with my hands. I am educated and can teach children should we be blessed with them. What I cannot do is walk or stand or contribute physical labor of the kind that requires legs. If that makes me unsuitable, I will accept your decision with understanding. But if you can see past what I lack to what I might offer, I promise you will not regret giving me a chance." The letter was signed simply Clara Hartwell, and beneath her name she had added one more line: "I am not asking for charity. I am offering partnership." Elias read the letter 3 times as the sun sank lower and the evening chill settled in. By the 3rd reading, his hands had stopped shaking, his mind had stopped racing. In the stillness beside the creek, with only the sound of moving water and wind in the pines, he began to see clearly. He thought of his own life, the losses he'd suffered, the choices he'd made, the hard years in these mountains. He'd survived by being practical, by adapting, by never giving up even when circumstances seemed impossible. Those were the qualities he'd claimed to value in his letter to the matchmaker, and this woman, this Clara, had survived too, had adapted, had refused to give up. She'd crossed half a continent to meet a stranger, knowing full well that he might reject her the moment he saw her. That took more courage than anything Elias had done in his comfortable solitude. The deception still rankled, but as he sat there with her letter in his hands, Elias realized that his anger wasn't really directed at Clara. She'd tried to be honest. The matchmaker had been the one to lie. And if Elias was being truthful with himself, would he have agreed to meet Clara if he'd known from the start? He wanted to believe he would have, but he wasn't certain. The real question was what he would do now. He could go back tomorrow and tell her it wouldn't work, send her back east with his apologies and some money for her trouble, resume his solitary life. It would be easier, simpler. But as he stood and walked back to his horse, Elias knew he wouldn't do that, couldn't do that. Something in Clara's letter, in her steady gaze, in the dignity with which she'd sat on that porch waiting for his judgment, something had reached into the closed-off places of his heart and demanded a response. He'd made her a promise when he'd sent that letter to the matchmaker. He'd offered marriage, partnership, a life together. The fact that she couldn't walk didn't change what he'd offered. It only changed how they'd have to build that life. The ride back up the mountain was slow and thoughtful. By the time Elias reached his cabin, stars were emerging in the darkening sky. He lit a lamp, made himself something to eat, and sat at his table planning. The cabin would need changes, many changes. He looked at it with new eyes now, seeing all the obstacles Clara would face. The steps up to the porch, the high shelves, the narrow doorway, the rough floor. But obstacles could be overcome. He'd spent 20 years overcoming obstacles in these mountains. This would just be a different kind of challenge. As he lay in bed that night, Elias made his decision. Tomorrow he would ride back down to the settlement. He would face Clara again, this time with clear eyes and an open mind. He would apologize for his reaction, explain that he needed time to adjust his thinking, and ask her if she was still willing to give this unlikely marriage a chance. What happened after that would depend on both of them. But for the first time since he'd seen her on that porch, Elias felt something other than shock and confusion. He felt the spark of something that might, eventually, become hope. 3 weeks into their marriage, the cabin had transformed. Curtains hung at the window, softening the harsh light. Clara's belongings had found their places, her books on a shelf Elias had built at the right height, her sewing materials in a basket by her favorite spot near the fire. The space no longer felt like a bachelor's rough shelter, it felt like a home. Clara had claimed the flat area behind the cabin as her garden plot. Never mind that it was late summer and too late to plant much of anything. She spent hours out there, planning, measuring with a length of string, talking about what she'd grow come spring. Vegetables, of course, she told Elias one afternoon as he helped her clear rocks from the soil. Potatoes, carrots, beans, but also herbs, sage, thyme, rosemary, and maybe some flowers. Marigolds are sturdy. Flowers? He'd never thought about growing flowers. They seemed impractical. They're cheerful, Clara said simply. And this place could use some cheer. He couldn't argue with that. He helped her mark out the plot, built raised beds that would be easier for her to reach from her chair. The work was good, purposeful, and he found he liked listening to her plans, her vision of what this place could become. It was during the 4th week that they had their first visitors. Elias heard horses coming up the trail and went out to see who it was. Samuel and Ruth Henderson rode into the clearing, Ruth sitting side-saddle with a basket over her arm. "Hope we're not intruding," Samuel called. "Ruth's been anxious to see how Clara's settling in." Elias helped Ruth down from her horse and watched as she hurried toward the cabin. Through the open door, he heard the women's voices rise in greeting, pleasure and relief, evident in both. Samuel stayed outside with him, looking around at the changes to the property. "You've been busy," Samuel observed. Clara has ideas. I just build what she designs. Elias surprised himself by feeling proud as he said it. They went inside, where Ruth was already exclaiming over the curtains, the organized cabin, the evidence of a woman's touch everywhere. But Elias watched the Hendersons' faces carefully when they saw Clara in her wheeled stool, moving competently around the cabin to put coffee on. Ruth's expression was warm, genuine. "Clara, this place looks wonderful. You've made it so cozy." But there was something else in Ruth's eyes too. Pity. The slight downturn of her mouth, the way her gaze kept drifting to the stool, to Clara's missing legs. It was subtle, probably unconscious, but Clara saw it. Elias saw her see it, saw the way her shoulders stiffened slightly. Samuel's reaction was different. He looked around the cabin, noted the modifications, the raised surfaces, the clever arrangements. When he looked at Clara, there was respect in his eyes. "You've done well here, Mrs. Boone. Takes considerable strength to manage a frontier household. I can see you've got that strength." Clara's grateful smile at Samuel was genuine. But when Ruth continued with, "You poor dear, it must be so difficult for you," Clara's expression became carefully neutral. "I manage," she said quietly. Elias felt a surge of protectiveness. He moved to stand near Clara, a subtle gesture of solidarity. "She does more than manage. The cabin's never been better run." They all sat for coffee and Ruth's pound cake. The conversation was pleasant enough, news from the valley, discussion of the weather, plans for winter preparations. But there was an undercurrent Elias couldn't quite name. Ruth meant well, he could see that. But her constant references to Clara's difficulties, her offers of help with things Clara was already handling, her assumption that life must be so hard it grated. Finally, Clara said with quiet firmness, "Ruth, I appreciate your concern, but I've been managing my limitations for 21 years. I know what I can and can't do. What I need most is to be treated as capable of what I am capable of." Ruth blinked, taken aback. Then her face softened into understanding. "Of course. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "I know you didn't," Clara said, gentler now. "But pity doesn't help. Friendship does." After the Hendersons left, Clara was quiet. Elias cleaned up the coffee cups while she sat staring out the window. "Ruth means well," he offered. "I know. They all do. The ones who pity me, at least. It's better than the ones who treat me like I'm invisible or simple-minded." She turned to look at him. "Thank you for what you said. About the cabin being well run. It's true. Maybe. But you didn't have to say it in front of them. You could have let them think whatever they wanted." "I said it because it's true," Elias repeated. "And because you're my wife. That means something." He saw her eyes brighten with unshed tears, but she blinked them away. "It does, doesn't it?" That evening, they sat closer together by the fire than usual. Not touching, but near enough that Elias could have reached out if he'd wanted to. Clara was working on his new shirt, her needle moving with steady precision. "Tell me something," she said without looking up from her sewing. "About your life before the mountains." It was the first time she'd asked directly. He'd offered pieces of his past in their conversations, but she'd never pushed for more. Now, in the firelit quiet, he found himself wanting to tell her. "There was a woman, Margaret. We were engaged to marry." The words came slowly, each one pulled from a place he'd kept sealed. "She died in childbirth. The baby, too. A boy." Clara's hands stilled on the fabric. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, 23 years. But saying it still hurt. I couldn't stay there. Everything reminded me of what I'd lost. So I came west, kept going until there was nowhere left to go but up. And you've been alone ever since. Seemed easier that way. Safer." He looked at her. "What about you? Your letter mentioned someone." Clara's mouth tightened. "Thomas. We'd known each other since childhood. After the accident, he still came around for a while. But when his family started talking about marriage, about futures, he stopped visiting. Sent a letter saying he'd always care for me, but couldn't tie himself to someone who'd be a burden all his life. He was a fool, maybe. Or maybe he was honest about what he could handle. Not everyone has the strength for this kind of life. You do. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. Two people who'd been broken by life and had learned to keep going anyway. So do you, she said softly. Elias reached out tentatively and touched Clara's hand where it rested on the fabric. She didn't pull away. Her fingers turned, curled around his. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, the fire crackling between them. I think, Elias said carefully, we might be good for each other. I think so too. That night, when it came time for sleep, Elias started to make up his pallet on the floor as usual. But Clara's voice stopped him. Elias? He turned. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, but her gaze was steady on his. You don't have to sleep on the floor anymore, if you don't want to. His heart hammered in his chest. Clara, I'm not saying I mean we don't have to. She took a breath, started again. I'm just saying the bed is big enough for two. And you've been a gentleman. I trust you. Trust. The word meant everything. He crossed the room slowly, sat on the other edge of the bed. They lay down with a careful distance between them, both on their backs, staring at the ceiling. Good night, Clara. Good night, Elias. He lay awake for a long time, aware of her breathing beside him, aware of the significance of this small step. They were still learning each other, still finding their way. But they were doing it together now, really together. Early autumn arrived with a crispness in the air that promised winter wasn't far behind. The aspens turned gold on the mountainsides, and Clara pointed them out with delight, marveling at the way the light caught in the leaves. Elias found himself seeing the landscape through her eyes, appreciating beauty he'd stopped noticing years ago. The cabin had settled into comfortable rhythms. Clara managed the household with quiet efficiency, and Elias no longer second-guessed her abilities. She could do what she could do, and they'd figured out workarounds for everything else. The wheelable stool was a daily miracle. She moved around the cabin with it as easily as anyone else walked. Outside was more challenging, but the ramp helped, and Elias had smoothed a path from the cabin to the garden plot. One afternoon, a young man appeared at the edge of the clearing. He was maybe 25, trail-worn, and carrying a bedroll. A drifter looking for work or a meal, Elias figured. They got them occasionally, men passing through on their way to somewhere else. Afternoon, the man called. Saw your smoke, wondering if you might have work for a willing hand, or at least a meal to spare. Elias walked out to meet him, sizing him up. The young man had hard eyes and an edge to him that Elias didn't much care for, but he'd been a stranger in need once himself. I can spare a meal. No work, though. I manage on my own. Much obliged. The man followed Elias toward the cabin. Then he saw Clara through the open door, working at the table, and his expression shifted into something that made Elias's hackles rise. Inside, Elias made introductions curtly. My wife Clara, this is Jake. The man supplied, but his eyes were fixed on Clara's stool, on the obvious fact that she couldn't stand to greet him properly. Well now, mail-order bride, I heard tell. Didn't hear about the special circumstances. The words were innocent enough, but the tone wasn't. There was mockery in it, and something uglier. Clara's face flushed, but she kept her composure. Would you like coffee, Mr. Jake? She asked politely. Don't know how you manage up here, Jake continued, as if she hadn't spoken, addressing Elias now. Hard enough for an able-bodied woman. Must be quite the burden, having a crippled wife? The word hung in the air like a slap. Clara went very still. Elias felt rage rise in his chest, hot and fierce. He'd been a peaceful man for 20 years, avoiding conflict, keeping to himself. But this he wouldn't tolerate. "You'll leave now," Elias said, his voice deadly quiet. Jake blinked. "What? I don't care what you were, you disrespected my wife in her own home. You'll leave. Now, look, mister, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just saying—" Elias took a step toward him, and something in his posture must have communicated what his words hadn't. Jake backed up, hands raised. All right. I'm going. No need to get violent. There's every need," Elias said. "But I'm giving you the chance to walk away. Don't make me regret it." Jake left quickly, muttering under his breath. Elias stood in the doorway until the man was out of sight down the trail, making sure he was really gone. When he turned back inside, Clara was sitting exactly as she'd been, her hands folded on the table, but her face was pale. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did. I'm used to people like him. I've heard worse." "Not in my house, you won't." Elias crossed to her, knelt down so they were at eye level. "Clara, you're my wife. That means something to me. It means I won't let anyone treat you with anything less than respect." A tear escaped down her cheek before she could stop it. "Why? Why what? Why do you care? This is just an arrangement. A convenience. I help you keep house. You give me a place to live. That's all this is. Was it?" Elias realized with sudden clarity that somewhere along the way it had become more than that. He wasn't sure when exactly, maybe the night they'd first shared the bed, maybe the moment she'd smiled at him over coffee that first morning. Maybe it had been building gradually through all the small domestic moments they'd shared. "No," he said firmly. "It's more than that. At least, it is for me, Elias." He reached up and gently wiped the tear from her face. "I'm not good with words. Never have been. But I need you to know you're not a burden. You're not charity. You've made this place into a home. You've made me remember what it's like to have someone to care for, someone who cares back. That's worth more than I can say." Clara's composure crumbled. She covered her face with her hands and wept, the kind of crying that came from years of holding back. Elias pulled her into his arms, awkward and uncertain but determined, to offer whatever comfort he could. She clung to him, her fingers gripping his shirt, and he held her until the tears subsided. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy but somehow more open than he'd ever seen it. "I care for you too," she whispered, "more than I expected to, more than I thought I could." "Then we're agreed," Elias said. "This is more than an arrangement." That evening, they sat together on the massive bearskin rug in front of the fire. It was easier for Clara than the chairs, and more intimate somehow. Elias told her the story of the grizzly, how he'd killed it in his second year on the mountain, how it had nearly killed him first. Clara listened with wide eyes, then ran her hand over the thick fur. "You've survived a lot," she said. "So have you." She leaned against him then, her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that in comfortable silence. When she turned her face up to his, Elias kissed her. It was gentle, tentative, a question as much as a statement. She kissed him back, and it was an answer. That night, their marriage became real in every sense. There was tenderness in it, and awkwardness, and moments of uncertainty. But there was also connection, genuine and deep. Afterward, Clara lay in his arms, and Elias felt a contentment he'd never known. "I love you," he said into the darkness. The words felt strange on his tongue. He'd only said them to one other person in his life, but they felt true. Clara's hand found his. "I love you too." Outside, the autumn wind whispered through the pines. Inside, two lonely people had found something neither of them had been looking for, but both desperately needed. The lawyer arrived on a crisp October afternoon, riding a fine horse and wearing a suit that looked absurdly out of place in the mountain wilderness. Elias was chopping wood when he noticed the rider approaching, and something about the man's careful, deliberate progress up the trail set warning bells ringing. "Mr. Boone?" the man called as he approached. "Elias Boone?" "That's right." Elias set down his axe, wiping sweat from his forehead. What can I do for you? My name is Theodore Whitmore. I'm an attorney from Denver. He dismounted carefully, clearly uncomfortable with both the horse and the rough terrain. I'm actually looking for a Mrs. Clara Boone, formerly Clara Hartwell. I was told she might be here. Elias's protective instincts kicked in immediately. What's this about? It's a legal matter concerning her late father's estate. Is she here? I've been searching for her for several months. Clara appeared in the doorway of the cabin, alerted by the voices. I'm Clara Boone. Whitmore's eyes widened slightly when he saw the wheeled stool, but he recovered quickly and removed his hat. Mrs. Boone, I apologize for arriving unannounced. I've been trying to locate you since May. The boarding house in Philadelphia said you'd gone west to marry, but they didn't have details. What's this about my father? Clara's voice was controlled, but Elias could hear the tension in it. Her father had died 2 years ago, leaving her alone and struggling. The estate, such as it was, had been settled long ago. Perhaps we could speak inside, Whitmore suggested. I have documents that require your attention. Elias helped Clara back inside, and they sat at the table while Whitmore opened his leather satchel and removed a sheaf of papers. The lawyer's expression was serious, but not unkind. Mrs. Boone, I'm pleased to inform you that your father's estate has been reassessed. There were assets that weren't discovered during the initial settlement, primarily from the sale of his carpentry business, which went through after his death. Additionally, there was a life insurance policy that has now been paid out. Clara stared at him. I don't understand. There was nothing. The boarding house took what little he had for his final expenses. Your father had made arrangements before his illness progressed. He sold his workshop and tools to a younger carpenter, but the payment was structured as a long-term note. The buyer has been making payments regularly. Additionally, your father had a small life insurance policy through his Craftsman's Guild that you weren't aware of. Whitmore slid papers across the table. Combined with accumulated interest, the total comes to approximately $8,000. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Elias, standing behind Clara, felt the shock of it like a physical blow. $8,000 was a fortune, more money than most people saw in a lifetime. That can't be right, Clara whispered. 8,000, that's, I assure you, it's correct. The funds have been held in trust, pending your location. Now that I've found you, we can proceed with the transfer. Whitmore pulled out more papers. You'll need to sign here and here. I'll need proof of identity, though your marriage certificate should suffice. Once we obtain it. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for the papers. Elias watched her read through them, saw the moment the reality sank in. She was wealthy, not extravagantly so, but comfortable, secure. She would never have to worry about money again. She would never need him again. The thought hit Elias like a punch to the gut. He stepped back, moved to the window, staring out at the mountains while Whitmore explained the details. Transfer of funds, investment options. The lawyer had taken rooms in the settlement below and could stay a few days to help with the paperwork. Mrs. Boone, Whitmore said carefully, I understand you're living in somewhat rustic circumstances. With this inheritance, you have options now. You could return east, live comfortably in a city where there are better accommodations for your particular situation. Medical care, society. Elias's hands clenched on the window frame. Of course that's what would happen. Clara would leave. Why wouldn't she? She'd come here out of desperation because she had no other choice. Now, she had choices. She had everything. I need time to think about this, Clara said, her voice steady but strained. Can you come back tomorrow, Mr. Whitmore? Of course. I'm at the Hendersons' homestead if you need me. Take all the time you need. After the lawyer left, the silence in the cabin was suffocating. Elias couldn't turn around, couldn't face Clara. He heard her wheel her stool across the floor, heard it stop behind him. Elias, you'll leave now. He said it flatly, trying to keep emotion out of his voice. It makes sense. You should go. Should I? Clara, you came here because you had nowhere else to go. You married me because you needed security. Now you don't need that anymore. You don't need... He couldn't finish. Couldn't say you don't need me. Turn around and look at me. He did, reluctantly. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fierce. How dare you, she said quietly. How dare you assume you know what I need or what I want? I'm being practical. You're being a coward. The words were sharp enough to cut. You're assuming I'll leave so you can protect yourself from being hurt when I do. But you don't get to make that choice for me. Why would you stay? The question burst out of him, raw and honest. You have money now. You could live anywhere, be comfortable, have everything you couldn't have before. Why would you stay in a rough cabin on a mountain with a man you barely know? Because I love you, you stubborn fool. The words hung in the air between them. Clara's chest was heaving, her hands gripping the arms of her stool so hard her knuckles were white. I didn't come here looking for love, she continued, her voice breaking. I came looking for survival. But I found something better. I found a partner, a home, a man who doesn't see me as broken or lesser or pitiable, who defends me, who's made more changes to accommodate me in 2 months than anyone ever did in 21 years, who looks at me like I'm... She stopped, swallowed hard. Like I'm whole. Elias's throat was tight. Clara, the money doesn't change anything, she said firmly, except that now we have options. We can improve the cabin, build a proper barn, maybe travel to Denver when winter comes so I can see a real doctor, make sure I'm... She faltered. Make sure I can carry a child safely. The implication of those words hit him like lightning. You think you might be... I don't know. It's too early to know. But Elias, I want that, with you. Here. She reached out and grabbed his hand. This is my home now. You're my home. Money doesn't change that. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands covering hers. I thought I was so sure you'd want to leave. I know. I could see it in your face the moment that lawyer mentioned the money. You went somewhere else in your head, started protecting yourself. She touched his face gently. But I'm not Margaret. I'm not going to be taken from you. And I'm not leaving you. You could have a better life. I have the life I want. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. Don't you understand? I spent 21 years being told what I couldn't do, what I couldn't have, what I couldn't be. I was invisible in Philadelphia, an object of pity. But here I matter. What I do matters. You see me, Elias. Really see me. Not just my limitations. Why would I give that up for comfort? He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. His own eyes were burning with tears he hadn't shed in decades. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I doubted you. Just promise me something, she said against his shoulder. Promise you won't assume you know what's best for me. We make decisions together. That's what partners do. I promise. They held each other for a long time. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Finally, Elias pulled back enough to look at her. What do you want to do about the money? Clara wiped her eyes, a smile breaking through despite the tears. Well, first we're going to get proper paperwork in order. Then we're going to invest most of it safely. Mr. Whitmore can help with that. But I think we should use some to make real improvements here. A larger cabin, maybe. Space for children. Better equipment. And yes, a trip to Denver. I want to see a doctor, make sure everything's all right. We can do all of that, Elias agreed. Whatever you want. What I want, Clara said, taking his face in her hands, is to build a life here with you. The money just means we can build it better, stronger. But the foundation that's already here, that's us. He kissed her then, pouring everything he felt into it, the fear he'd experienced, the relief, the love that had grown without him quite noticing until it was too big to ignore. When they finally broke apart, Clara was smiling through her tears. "We should probably tell Mr. Whitmore I'm staying." "Tomorrow," Elias said. "Tonight, I just want to hold you and remember how lucky I am." "We're both lucky," Clara corrected. That matchmaker's deception turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to either of us. He couldn't argue with that. They'd both come to this marriage expecting one thing and found something entirely different, something infinitely better. The inheritance didn't change that. If anything, it proved that Clara's commitment was real. She was choosing him, choosing this life, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. As night fell over the mountains, they lay together in bed, talking about the future in a way they never had before. Real plans. Solid plans. A bigger cabin by next summer. A trip to Denver in winter. Maybe, if they were blessed, a baby next spring. The money had changed their circumstances, but it hadn't changed what mattered most. They'd found each other, and they weren't letting go. The weeks following the lawyer's visit were filled with planning and hope. Clara and Elias met with Mr. Whitmore several times, signing papers and making arrangements for the inheritance. Most of the money would be invested safely, providing steady income for years to come. But they set aside a portion for immediate improvements and, most importantly, for the trip to Denver. Clara wanted to see a doctor before winter set in completely. She'd never had proper medical care for her condition, just the country doctor who'd tried his best when she was 7, and the occasional check by a local physician in Philadelphia who'd offered more pity than expertise. Now, with resources and a husband who supported her completely, she wanted answers. Could she safely carry a child? Were there treatments that might help with the chronic pain she sometimes experienced? Were the stumps of her legs as healthy as they could be? They planned to leave in late October, before the mountain passes became impassable, but after the harvest was secured. Clara threw herself into preparations with an energy Elias had never seen before. She preserved vegetables from her garden, put up stores of food for their absence, sewed warmer clothes for both of them. The trip would take nearly a week each way, and they'd need to stay in Denver for at least 2 weeks for all the appointments she wanted to make. One evening, as they sat together reviewing the supply list Clara had made, she looked up at him with sudden uncertainty. "What if the doctor tells me I can't have children?" Elias set down the paper he'd been reading. "Then we'll deal with that together." "But I know you want—" "I want you," he interrupted firmly. "Children would be a blessing, but you're not less valuable to me if we can't have them. You understand that, don't you?" She nodded, but he could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. He reached across the table and took her. "Clara, I spent 20 years alone on this mountain, convincing myself I didn't need anyone. Then you came along and showed me what I'd been missing, a partner, someone to share the sunsets with, someone whose laugh I'd recognize anywhere, someone who makes even ordinary days feel like they matter." He squeezed her hand. "That's what you've given me. Everything else is extra." She smiled through sudden tears. "How did I get so lucky? I ask myself that every morning when I wake up next to you." The day before they were scheduled to leave, Samuel and Ruth Henderson visited, bringing supplies for the journey and offering to check on the cabin while they were gone. Ruth had news that made Clara's eyes light up. "I'm expecting," Ruth said, her hand unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. "The baby should come in the spring." Clara's joy was genuine and immediate. "Ruth, that's wonderful. I was hoping, well, if you're back from Denver by then, would you consider being the godmother?" The question clearly moved Clara deeply. "I'd be honored." The women talked about babies and pregnancy, while Elias and Samuel discussed the practical matters of the trip. Samuel had made the journey to Denver twice and had advice about the best routes, where to stay, which doctors were most reputable. "There's a Dr. Elizabeth Garrett," Samuel said. "She's got a practice near the hospital. She's known for being good with difficult cases. She doesn't judge, if you know what I mean. Ruth saw her before we came out here." Elias filed the name away carefully. A woman doctor might make Clara more comfortable, especially for such personal examinations. After the Hendersons left, Elias and Clara spent the evening doing final preparations. The cabin would be closed up but not abandoned. They'd be back before the deep snows came. Elias banked the fire carefully, secured the shutters, made sure everything was weatherproof. They left at dawn. The wagon, loaded with their supplies, and Clara's wheelchair secured in the back. Elias had debated about bringing it. The wheeled stool was easier for travel, but Clara had insisted. In Denver, with paved streets and proper buildings, the chair might actually be useful. The journey down from the mountains was slow but uneventful. They stopped at the Henderson place the first night, then continued on to the settlement the next day. From there, they joined a freight wagon heading to Denver, paying for passage for themselves and their belongings. The days on the road were long, but not unpleasant. Clara was fascinated by everything, the changing landscape as they descended from the mountains, the other travelers they encountered, the small towns they passed through. Elias watched her take it all in, saw how much she'd been starved for new experiences in her years of limited mobility in Philadelphia. "I never thought I'd travel like this," she said one evening as they camped with the freight crew. "I always assumed I'd spend my whole life in one place. Do you miss Philadelphia?" She considered the question seriously. "I miss some things. The library, the music at the church. But not the life I had there. That wasn't really living, it was just existing." Denver, when they finally reached it, was overwhelming after months in the mountains. The noise, the crowds, the sheer number of people and buildings, it was almost too much. But Clara navigated it with surprising confidence, directing Elias to push her wheelchair down boardwalks, asking shopkeepers for directions, engaging with the city in a way that showed she'd once been comfortable in such places. They found rooms at a modest but clean boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She took one look at Clara's wheelchair and immediately offered them a ground-floor room, no questions asked, no pity in her eyes, just practical accommodation. "My late husband lost his legs in the war," she explained simply. "I know what's needed." The room was small but comfortable, with a real bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto a tree-lined street. After months in the cabin, it felt almost decadently luxurious. The next morning, they went to find Dr. Garrett. Her office was in a neat brick building near the hospital, and the nurse who greeted them was professional and kind. When Dr. Garrett appeared, she was younger than Elias expected, perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes and capable hands. "Mrs. Boone," she said, shaking Clara's hand firmly. "I understand you'd like a complete examination." "Yes. I've never had proper medical care since my accident. And I'd like to know." Clara glanced at Elias, drew strength from his presence. "I'd like to know if I can safely have children." Dr. Garrett's expression was serious but warm. "Let's take a thorough look and see what we're working with. Mr. Boone, you're welcome to stay or to wait outside, whatever makes your wife most comfortable." "I'll stay," Clara said immediately. "If that's all right." "Of course." The examination took over an hour. Dr. Garrett was thorough, asking detailed questions about the original accident, the subsequent healing, any pain or problems Clara experienced. She examined the stumps of Clara's legs carefully, checked her overall health, and asked frank questions about their intimate life that made both Clara and Elias blush, but which the doctor treated as routine medical information. Finally, Dr. Garrett helped Clara dress and sat down to discuss her findings. "First, the good news," she said. "Your legs, or what remains of them, are remarkably healthy. Whoever did the original amputation did good work under what I'm sure were difficult circumstances. There's no sign of infection or ongoing problems. The pain you experience occasionally is normal phantom pain and muscle aches from compensating. I can give you some exercises that might help." Clara gripped Elias's hand tightly. "And children?" There's no medical reason you can't conceive and carry a child to term, Dr. Garrett said carefully. Your reproductive system appears healthy. However, I won't lie to you. Pregnancy and childbirth will be more challenging for you than for a woman with full mobility. You'll need to be monitored closely. The weight of pregnancy will affect your balance and your ability to move safely. Labor and delivery will require special positioning and assistance. But it's possible? Clara's voice was barely a whisper. It's possible, and I'd be willing to supervise your care if you choose to do this. You'd need to be in Denver for the last 2 months of pregnancy and for the birth itself. But yes, Mrs. Boone, you can be a mother. Clara broke down then, sobbing with relief and joy. Elias held her while Dr. Garrett discreetly left them alone for a few minutes. When they'd composed themselves, the doctor returned with specific instructions. If you do conceive, you need to see a doctor regularly, more regularly than most women. And you need to promise me you'll come to Denver well before your due date. I've seen too many frontier births go wrong because women waited too long to get help. I promise, Clara said fervently. They left the doctor's office in a daze of hope. On the street outside, Clara looked up at Elias with shining eyes. We can have a family, she said. We can really do this. We can, he agreed, his own voice thick with emotion. They spent 2 weeks in Denver, seeing Dr. Garrett twice more, meeting with Mr. Whitmore to finalize the investment arrangements and ordering supplies they couldn't get in the mountains. Clara bought books on childbirth and child-rearing. Elias commissioned a skilled carpenter to build a better wheelchair, one with larger wheels that might handle rougher terrain. But as the days passed, both of them grew restless for home. The city was interesting, but it wasn't where they belonged. Their life was in the mountains. In the cabin, they were already planning to expand. On their last evening in Denver, they had dinner at a restaurant, a real restaurant, with tablecloths and multiple courses. It was a treat, a celebration of good news and hopeful futures. But as they ate, Clara kept glancing toward the western horizon, where the mountains rose in the distance. "Ready to go home?" Elias asked, reading her thoughts. "More than ready." The journey back seemed shorter, perhaps because they were traveling toward something rather than away from it. The mountains welcomed them with the first serious snow of the season, not enough to block the passes yet, but enough to dust the peaks with white. When the cabin finally came into view, both of them felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where they belonged. This was home. Elias carried Clara over the threshold again, just as he had the first time, but now there was no awkwardness, no uncertainty. There was just love and the knowledge that they'd weathered their first real test as a couple. That night, as snow fell softly outside and the fire crackled warmly inside, they lay together in their bed, the bed they'd soon need to expand, the cabin they'd soon need to rebuild to accommodate a growing family. "Thank you," Clara whispered in the darkness. "For what?" "For seeing me, for choosing me, for building this life with me." Elias pulled her closer. "You gave me everything I didn't know I needed. That's me thanking you." Outside, winter was coming, but inside, wrapped in each other's arms, they'd never felt warmer. The weather broke on December 20th, giving them a window to make the journey down to the settlement. Elias bundled Clara in every warm thing they owned and carried her to the wagon he'd prepared. The new wheelchair from Denver was strapped in back, along with supplies for an extended stay away from home. The descent was treacherous. Ice made the trail dangerous, and Elias had to lead the horse carefully, testing each step. Clara sat wrapped in blankets, her face pale but determined. She knew this was necessary. They both did. At the Hendersons' place, Ruth greeted them with relief. Her own pregnancy was showing now, her belly rounded under her dress. She helped Elias get Clara inside and settled while Samuel came out to talk about the arrangements. "We'll check on the cabin once a week," Samuel promised. "Make sure everything stays secure." You just focus on getting that baby here safe. I can't thank you enough, Elias said. That's what neighbors do. They stayed overnight with the Hendersons, and Ruth and Clara talked late into the evening about babies and births and the fears that came with bringing new life into the world. Elias could hear their soft voices from where he sat with Samuel by the fire, and he was grateful Clara had another woman to confide in. The next morning, they continued to the settlement and caught the freight wagon heading to Denver. The journey took 6 days longer than usual because of the weather. Clara was exhausted by the time they arrived, and Elias was worried about how pale she looked. Mrs. Patterson welcomed them back to her boarding house with warm efficiency. "I saved the ground floor room for you," she said. "Figured you might need it again." They settled into a routine over the following weeks. Clara saw Dr. Garrett regularly, and the doctor was pleased with how the pregnancy was progressing. The baby was healthy and strong. Clara was managing better than expected, though the physical challenges were increasing as she grew larger. Elias found work during their stay, helping at a carpentry shop, using skills he'd developed building his cabin. The pay was modest, but it helped offset their expenses. More importantly, it gave him something to do while Clara rested, keeping him from worrying himself into uselessness. January passed into February, and Clara grew larger. Movement became increasingly difficult for her. The wheelchair was essential. Now, without it, she couldn't get around at all. But her spirits remained strong, buoyed by regular visits to Dr. Garrett and the knowledge that every day brought them closer to meeting their child. In early March, Ruth Henderson's baby came. Word reached them through a letter Samuel sent to the Denver post office. A healthy girl, born without complications, mother and baby both doing well. Clara wept with joy and relief when she read it, grateful that her friend had come through safely. "That will be us soon," she said to Elias that evening. "A few more weeks," he agreed. "Dr. Garrett thinks late March or early April. I can't wait to meet our baby, to hold them, to take them home." Home, the word carried such weight now. The cabin in the mountains felt very far away, but it was there waiting for them. Elias had received confirmation from Samuel that everything remained secure. Spring would come to the high country. In a few more weeks, and then they could return. The contractions started on March 28th, 3 weeks before the baby was due. Clara woke Elias in the middle of the night, her hand gripping his arm. "It's time." He'd been through this once before, 23 years ago with Margaret. But that birth had ended in tragedy, and the fear of it happening again nearly paralyzed him. He forced himself to move, to think clearly. They needed to get to the hospital. Dr. Garrett had given them specific instructions for when labor started. He got Clara dressed, got her into the wheelchair, and wheeled her through the dark streets to the hospital. It was only a few blocks, but it felt like miles. The night watchman let them in, and a nurse went running for Dr. Garrett. The labor was long 18 hours that tested every bit of Clara's strength and Elias's resolve. Dr. Garrett was calm and professional throughout, directing the nurses, adjusting Clara's position to compensate for her lack of mobility, talking her through each stage. Elias stayed by Clara's head, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her face, telling her over and over that she could do this, that she was strong enough, that he loved her. When the baby finally came a boy, red-faced and screaming with healthy lungs, Clara broke down in tears of exhausted relief. Dr. Garrett placed the baby on Clara's chest, and Elias watched his wife hold their son for the first time with such wonder on her face that it made his own eyes burn. "He's perfect," Clara whispered. "Elias, he's perfect. Just like his mother," Elias managed to say through the tightness in his throat. They named him James, after Clara's father. James Boone, born in Denver but destined for the mountains. Born to parents who'd found each other through deception and desperation, but who'd built something real and lasting from those unlikely foundations. Dr. Garrett examined both mother and baby thoroughly and pronounced them healthy. "You did beautifully, Clara. I'm proud of you. When can we go home?" Clara asked. "Doctor," Garrett smiled, "give it a few weeks. Let yourself heal, let the baby grow a bit stronger. Then you can take your son home to the mountains. A few weeks, they could manage that. They'd come this far, they could wait a little longer." Spring came to the Colorado mountains with a softness that felt like a gift. The snow melted slowly, revealing the earth beneath muddy and rich and ready for new growth. The aspens budded green, and wildflowers began to emerge in the meadows. The creek swelled with runoff, its voice loud and joyful after the long silence of winter. Elias and Clara brought their son home in late April, when the mountain passes were clear and the weather had settled into the gentle warmth of true spring. The journey up was slow and careful. They had precious cargo now, but the mountains welcomed them back as if they'd never left. The cabin stood just as they'd left it, weathered but sound. Samuel had kept his word, checking on it regularly, making sure no damage had occurred during the harsh winter. But it was still just one room, still the rough shelter Elias had built for himself all those years ago. That would change. They had plans, now real plans, backed by Clara's inheritance and their shared vision. But for now, it was enough to be home. Clara sat in the rocking chair Elias had built during those long winter months in Denver. He'd worked on it in every spare moment, crafting it specifically for her, the seat at the perfect height, the arms at just the right angle. It was made from pine and maple, sanded smooth and finished with oil until it glowed. He'd carved their initials on the back, intertwined with a small heart. It was his wedding gift to her, though they'd been married nearly a year. She rocked gently, baby James sleeping in her arms, and looked out the window at the view she'd come to love. The valley stretched below them, green now, instead of white. The distant peaks still wore their snowcaps, but down here life was bursting forth everywhere. "I miss this," she said softly. "The city was fine, but this is home." Elias sat on the porch rail, watching her with their son. The sight filled him with a contentment so profound it almost hurt. "I never thought I'd have this. A family. A real home." "Neither did I." Clara looked up at him, and her smile was radiant. That matchmaker's lie turned out to be the greatest truth of both our lives. They'd received word that Mrs. Morrison, the matchmaker, had passed away over the winter. It had been peaceful, they were told in her sleep, surrounded by letters from couples she'd brought together. Clara had cried when she heard, grateful for the woman who'd seen something in both of them that they hadn't seen in themselves. Over the following weeks, they settled into life as a family. James was a good baby, healthy and content, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's strong features. Clara managed motherhood with the same competence she brought to everything else, adapting to the challenges with creative solutions. She'd fashioned a sling that let her carry James on her chest while she moved around in her wheelchair, keeping him close while she worked. The neighbors came to visit the Hendersons first, bringing their daughter Elizabeth to meet James. The two babies were only weeks apart, and Ruth and Clara talked about raising them together, about the children growing up as friends in this wild, beautiful place. Other families from the valley made the journey up the mountain to meet the Boone's son. They came bearing gifts, food, clothes, practical items for a growing baby, and they came with acceptance. Clara was one of them now, fully integrated into the community. Not despite her wheelchair, but simply as herself, Clara Boone, wife to Elias, mother to James, friend and neighbor. In May, Elias began work on the new cabin. He'd hired 2 men from the settlement to help strong backs for the heavy work, and together they started to build. The new structure would be twice the size of the old one, with proper rooms, wider doorways, and smooth floors that Clara's wheelchair could navigate easily. There would be a bedroom for them, and a nursery for James, and space for more children if they were blessed with them. Clara directed much of the design, her practical mind thinking through what would work best. Elias built what she envisioned, and together they created something that was truly theirs, not just his bachelor cabin, but their family home. One evening in early June, as the sun set over the mountains and painted everything gold, Elias found Clara in her garden. She'd planted it as soon as the ground was workable, and now green shoots were emerging everywhere. Beans and carrots and herbs, and those marigolds she'd wanted, cheerful yellow flowers that nodded in the evening breeze. James was asleep in a basket beside her, and Clara was pulling weeds with her strong hands, humming softly to herself. She looked up when Elias approached, and her face lit with a smile that still made his heart catch. "Come see," she said. "The beans are coming up beautifully." He knelt beside her and admired the neat rows of seedlings. But what he was really looking at was her, his wife, his partner, the woman who'd come to him as a last resort and had become the center of his world. "I love you," he said, because it needed to be said, because he needed her to know it every day. "I love you too." She took his dirt-streaked hand in hers. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, for seeing past what I couldn't do to what I could. You gave me back my life, Clara. Everything that matters started the day you arrived on that porch." They sat together as the sun sank lower, James sleeping peacefully beside them, the garden growing around them, and the new cabin rising in the clearing. The mountains stood eternal and unchanged, but the lives being lived within them had transformed completely. A year ago, Elias Boone had been a lonely man, waiting for a mail-order bride he'd never met. Clara Hartwell had been a desperate woman, accepting a marriage proposal from a stranger. Neither of them had expected love, neither had expected partnership, neither had expected to find, in the harsh beauty of the Colorado wilderness, a place where they could both finally be whole. But life has a way of surprising us. The deceptions and desperation that brought them together had been transformed into something true and lasting, a love built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the daily choice to see the best in each other. As darkness fell and the first stars emerged, Elias carried Clara inside, then went back for James. The baby stirred and whimpered, and Clara soothed him with gentle words as she prepared to nurse him. Elias built up the fire and made tea, the domestic routine now as natural as breathing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The cabin construction would continue, the garden would need tending, James would grow and change, requiring new kinds of care. Life on the frontier was never easy, especially for a family like theirs, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference. In the flickering firelight, Elias watched his wife rock their son, and he understood something he'd never quite grasped before. Home wasn't a place. It wasn't these mountains, or this cabin, or even this land he loved. Home was wherever Clara was. Home was the family they were building. Home was this moment, and all the moments to come. The mountains had given him solitude for 20 years, but Clara had given him something infinitely more valuable. She'd given him a life worth living.